Hi, everybody. My name is Melissa Gerson. I'm a psychotherapist and the founder of Columbus Park, which is an outpatient treatment center for eating disorders. And I'm also the director of My Three Square, which is the platform that we're using today. I'm here today with my colleague, Courtney Levy Daniels. She's a therapist with our organization, and she's also in private practice. I'm thrilled to have her here with us today. I'm going to say a couple things about the structure today so you know what to expect, and then we're going to jump into organize the day meal support looks like in a setting. And so what we're going to do is start with our components. So I'm going to share what I brought for my meal. Courtney's going to share what she brought for her meal. We'll share a little bit about our thinking around how and what we decided to bring today. Then we're going to set an intention, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that means. And then Courtney and I are going to have a discussion. And the discussion is really designed to distract everybody from eating. So some people talk about mindful eating and how that can be a really helpful strategy to become more aware of your eating experience and to become more aware of your hunger and fullness cues. And so there's definitely a place for mindful eating. But what we find most often is that many of the people that we work with really get anxious when they're eating, that the eating process is just can be really full of a lot of judgments and sometimes some negative self-talk. And so what we find more effective than mindful eating at this stage is really distraction, trying to engage in conversation during eating, trying to listen to the presentation today, and using the time to just get through your meal and with as much of a calm status as you can. So we're going to chat a little bit. We're going to teach some skills. And throughout, I'm also going to put a timer on. So I'm going to let you know when we're about halfway finished with the meal portion. The idea here is that many people in eating disorder recovery are working on pacing, either trying to speed up their pacing a little bit. We see that a lot of that, or maybe even slow down pacing a little bit. So I'm going to let you know when we're halfway through with the 30-minute meal portion. And then I'm also going to let you know when we have 5 minutes left. And this is a good opportunity if you have any friends or you know anyone who might benefit from this format. It's a great time to either share or tag a friend. We're streaming right now live on Facebook, Instagram, on our website, and on YouTube. So, Courtney,
Yes.
would you like to start with your meal component?
Sure. Okay. So I'm like set up in a specific way. So I'm going to try to lift it.
Okay.
But I have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and then a brie bite. I don't know if you know what this is, but it's from Trader Joe's. It's like a mini brie, which is one of my favorite things.
Oh, how fun.
Yeah. So it has, the fat, protein, starch component. The reason I chose it is, I think right now, especially groceries are a little bit of an issue. It can be hard to get. So right now I'm waiting on a new batch of groceries. So I don't have a whole lot of like fresh produce stuff to incorporate into a meal. So I figured I would go with this. It's easy and it's something like I always have on hand. So this is like one of my go-tos when kind of just in between groceries and things like that.
And very much in keeping with all of our realities right now that grocery store visits are infrequent and it's really hard to get a hold of your typical food. So I know everybody's most likely most people out there are struggling with that. So thank you. So I think what you referenced is that usually when we come up with a meal for meal support, we want the meal to be balanced. And the way we think about that is without getting really in our heads or super specific. We really discourage weighing or measuring food, but we think loosely about having a balanced meal as having a protein component, a carbohydrate, adequate fat, and then you can have a fruit or vegetable with it. So we talk about, can you have a sandwich and a side? Or if you have a salad for a meal, can you be sure that there's adequate fat in the meal, that there's protein in the salad, that there's, real dressing, that there is carbohydrate, whether it's croutons or a roll or something on the side or sweet potato. So that's kind of how we think about being sure that your needs are met in these meals. So here, I'm going to share what I have today. This was a little new for me. I'm not sure how it really turned out. I made myself a quesadilla. I was kind of scrambling, right, for a minute before this started, getting very nervous I was going to burn it. But I have a quesadilla just with cheese. I sprinkled some cheese on 2 pieces of flour tortilla. And then as a side over here, I thought avocado might go well with the quesadilla. So I have avocado and tomato salad. And I have seltzer, which is my kind of go-to drink. And the way I thought about putting this together really was based on what I had in the house. I kind of felt like some sort of sandwichy type thing, but was feeling cold today. So I thought maybe having a warm sandwich would feel kind of good. And I also felt like I was craving something zesty, like a salad dressing type situation. So I decided the avocado, sort of in keeping with the, I don't know, Tex-Mex feel, and the tomatoes. So I'm coming into this meal definitely very hungry. And that's also another thing we tend to do. We kind of check in before the meal to see if our participants are in touch with feeling hungry, feeling full, feeling nervous, feeling anxious. And if you are having any sort of intense emotion, how might that be impacting your hunger, fullness? So I'm going to set the timer, not to make anybody nervous, but just for us to be able to be aware of our pacing and timing. So Courtney, I may interrupt in 15 minutes and say, hey, we're halfway finished with the meal portion, so don't mind me. And I think we can start chatting.
Awesome.
So Courtney, I think you wanted to introduce yourself in a very particular way, which I appreciate.
Yeah. So today we're going to be talking a lot about body image and body. So whenever I have a conversation like this, I do like to acknowledge my privilege. So, we're going to be talking about body. So I do want to note that I'm a cisgender, white, able-bodied, straight-sized woman. And the reason I bring this up is because I think it's important to acknowledge within the context of talking about bodies, kind of the privileges that I do have in that arena.
I'm going to introduce myself as well as a cisgender, white, able-bodied, straight-sized woman as well. And can we talk a little bit about that straight-sized component and what that means? Not everybody may be familiar with that concept or.
Sure. Yeah. So this is, I when I stumbled upon this term, it felt like a very useful term in terms of like describing my own body. And it's a term that a lot of people use. It's a term that originated in actually the fashion industry. It's a term that they use to describe bodies or clothing that is not plus size. So, straight size meaning like clothing that is not in a plus size store. You can fit within kind of, a store that you go to. And I like it because it's a more neutral term compared to those, like a term like normal, which I think assigns,
right?
Which like assigns this value to it, right? And I prefer this term too, just because I personally don't identify necessarily as thin, which is another term you could use. But I do have body privilege, and that I can easily shop for clothing at stores, and I don't get stigmatized by my size if I go to the doctor in the way that larger bodies do. So when discussing body image, I think it's just so important to acknowledge that we do live in a culture where that does discriminate based on body size. And so a lot of what we discuss here in terms of bodies and body image is invariably more challenging for those who live in larger bodies because of that added layer of weight stigma that exists in our culture. So
yeah, that's so well said, Courtney, and so accurate. And I agree with you. There's that term overweight, and if you really think about it, over what weight, what's normal weight, what's average weight.
So yeah. And in fact, like being plus size is more average, it's
so much more common. Yeah.
And like that term, some people say like the O term, because it's like, that term is just so stigmatizing in and of itself. So I often like to say like larger bodied or bigger bodied. And some people, will use the word fat, and claim that term. I personally will defer to someone and what they use to define or determine like how they describe their own bodies, just because that term, I think, for some people can be more loaded or come with like some judgment or stigma.
The term fat.
Yeah, the term. Yeah. But where other people really use that.
People are trying to kind of bring it back though, and take some of the power out of the word and using it as a more neutral term.
Yeah, which would be so ideal, right? If it was a more neutral term. But I think, as someone who isn't in a fat body, like I don't necessarily want to just assume that everyone feels comfortable with that term at this point.
Absolutely. So, I think that's a nice introduction into the topic that we're going to talk about today. And maybe, and forgive me, I'm talking with my mouth, with my food in my mouth, but it's meal support. That's what happens. I think our conversation today is really going to be on body image, but maybe you'll come back and we can talk more about weight stigma, because that's a whole other conversation. But maybe to start our conversation about body image today, there are these different movements right now around body image. I think people have heard a little bit about body positivity and that concept that we want to come around to a place, no matter, regardless of our size or shape, to a place of feeling like sort of affection and love for ourselves, and to be able to see ourselves in a positive light, and to make that transformation from maybe hating yourself to loving yourself. And then there's also another movement, which I kind of appreciate the language of this a lot, the body neutrality movement, the body neutral movement, where we're really thinking more about not necessarily that we have to have really positive feelings about our bodies, but can we accept them? Can we have a neutral position? Use neutral language around our bodies. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah. No, I think like at the core, I think body positivity, like there's good intention, right? Like I think it's ultimately like, you know, people are so critical of their bodies. Let's like shift the narrative. Let's make it more positive. But I think the challenge with body positivity is that it continues to place this emphasis on the appearance of our bodies as being kind of central to how we value ourselves. And that can just reinforce this idea that appearance of our bodies is so, so important. And the truth is that we don't have to love our bodies or love how we look in order to love our lives. And a lot of the body image work that I do is focusing on kind of de-emphasizing the role that our bodies are in terms of how we value ourselves. And the reason for that, I can go a little bit more into it, but it's because like our bodies in general are going to change over our lifespan. You know, like our bodies are always going to change. Also, we have much less control over the size of our bodies that diet culture kind of puts out there, right? This idea that like, you know, we can change our bodies, but really that's not the case. And so because of that, you know, if we put a lot of self-worth in our bodies, that this like, you know, thing that A, we don't have a whole lot of control over, and B, is going to invariably change over our lifespan, it kind of keeps our self-image in this really like fragile place where, you know, at any point things could change. And so I think in general, I like the idea of neutrality, kind of like you said, in that it's like, you know, finding a more neutral place or accepting place with your body. And I think more so just like making it less important, making it the, you know, maybe vehicle that kind of allows you to live this awesome life that you want to live, but not being central to like how we define or identify ourselves or value ourselves. Yeah.
I think what you're touching on is what we talk a lot about in treatment, which is that we want to expand domains of self-evaluation. So what that means is we want to increase our focus and attention to other parts of ourselves outside of body, to begin to put more effort and focus and more of our time and energy into developing those things, in the hope that doing so not only leads to a more meaningful, fuller, richer life, but also decreases the amount of emphasis we're putting on body. So oftentimes in treatment, what we'll do is we'll do a big circle, like a pie chart. And oftentimes our clients are saying, I mean, my body, my appearance, how I look, I'd say is, you know, 80% of my pie, or 90% or 75, whatever it is, it's usually a pretty high percentage. And the way we want to approach body work is to try to decrease that. Can you talk a little bit about what comes up for people when you do that, and what are some of the ways that people de-emphasize body? Not that you're saying it's not important anymore, but is it going to still be 80%, 90% of your self-worth?
Yeah, I think it's hard because I think sometimes, or we don't typically think about like, how do we value ourselves, right? Like that's not something that is so concretely thought of all the time. And so I think there's a lot that goes kind of into this exercise. And I think it starts with, I mean, you can take kind of a few entry points, but I think it's talking about values, right? Like, what are the things that are important to you? How do you, you know, maybe how do you want to value yourself, even if like internally right now, weight shape still feels most important. So I think it's looking at kind of values, really trying to distinguish between like, what are the values of like myself versus the values I might have inherited by, you know, family or culture, or, you know, my eating disorders values, right? So kind of starting to tease that apart. This is a little bit, kind of a little bit of a veer, but an exercise that I think can be helpful in kind of determining like, okay, how do I want, like, where do I want to place my emphasis in terms of like how I see myself and value, is to think about like, what is it that I think I will get if I, lose weight, or what am I fearing I will lose if I were to gain weight?
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of times, like, we live in a world where thinness, I think, is often equated with like success, love, care, acceptance, right? Like all of these things. And, it makes sense, right? Like these things are shown on TV and in all these different arenas, like thinness equates to all these things. So I think sometimes, like, when we say we're valuing, like when we're valuing on the surface, we're valuing, thinness or our bodies, but really what we might be valuing is like connection with people. And we've just so linked that to our bodies.
I think
and
you're right.
Yeah.
I think you're because when we do that exercise, sometimes in therapy, and like, let's just imagine that you have the body you want. What will you get? What will happen then? What's next? Oftentimes people will say, well, oftentimes I'll feel more confident. I'll feel better about myself. So I'll have more success in my relationships. I might even have more success professionally or in my school life. So there's this idea that somehow, I think oftentimes people say, I'll be more confident, so then I can have A, B, and C. So I think that's one thing that comes up a lot is I'll be more confident. The other thing is that almost always there's a relational component. Almost always the goal really of getting that body that you want is something you'll get from others, some kind of connection or value or love. So So I think the question is often in therapy, so either we can keep working to get you the body you want so you can get all those things, or we can help you to try to get all of those things regardless of what happens to your body.
Yeah. And like, we don't even know that you're going to get those things if your body changes, right? A lot of body image stuff. Yeah. A lot. And most often, right? Like there might be a short term, like a temporary, like, oh, I feel better because like I'm more socially accepted in some way. Right. Like, but at the core, like those things don't necessarily like come out of thin air and just like happen. And so I think, I think to your point, it's like really looking at like, what do those things mean? And I do want to validate, like, no wonder people want to lose weight or are afraid of gaining weight if it means that like they're not going to get the things in their life that they want.
Absolutely.
Right? Like if I genuinely am attaching like friendship and happiness and confidence to the size of my body, like no wonder there's such
you are going to go for it. You are going to try to get that body no matter what. Right.
And the reality is that like those things don't necessarily, like they don't go together. Right. Like, in fact, I would actually argue that a lot of times pursuing or manipulating your body in some way actually interferes with ultimately getting the thing you want. Right. Like, so for example, if
such a good point.
Yeah. Like if being in, relationships is really important to you, like a lot of what comes with relationships and what makes them so satisfying and fulfilling is like presence. Right. So like if I'm being present with my friends, I'm more likely probably to feel connected and engaged and, all those things. But if I'm, so focused, if my mind's, really thinking about food and my body all the time, like I'm not going to be able to be present.
Not going to be present. There's such a cost, right? It's because oftentimes, and especially people who end up going, it goes to an extreme for many people where it becomes your life. So what kind of life can you have if your life is really consumed in your eating disorder?
Yeah.
And we often talk about how the eating disorder is sometimes your central relationship. It's such an important relationship in your life. It's like your partner, it's your friend, it's your companion in a lot of ways, but it makes it really hard to devote any of yourself to true companions, true friends.
Totally, because it takes over. And I think it goes for eating disorders, but also dieting, right? Like any form of kind of emphasis placed on manipulating your body, like there's a consuming quality to it that can come up, or even just like a focus on like it takes up a lot of energy to focus on that thing that can be energy spent doing.
And just think about it. I mean, if you're on a diet, a strict diet, it's very hard to go out to eat with people. It's very hard to go to someone's home and just have accept whatever food they're serving. In fact, a lot of the people we work with will share that they'll cancel events, they'll cancel social events, they'll stay home, they won't go out, they may be more isolating, right? Because they're really in their disorder. So it really does, it's so interesting how the thing that people really want, what we all want, is that connection and that feeling valued and cared for. But unfortunately, pursuing thinness in order to get there often really does the exact opposite.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
totally. I mean, it is so complicated, and I could like go on and on about like, because there is positive reinforcement that comes attached with, changing shape and things like that, that can be kind of internalized as acceptance and things like that. But I think going back to your point about the confidence piece, that might be just like in terms of kind of thinking about how do we do this? Not that this is like, obviously I think meeting with a therapist and talking through some of this is super helpful, but I think words like confidence, happiness, right? A lot of what we hear, like, I will be happier, I will be confident. I think the first step is kind of breaking down, like, what does that mean? Like, what does happiness mean? What does confidence mean? Like, how do I know that I'm happy? How do I know that I'm confident? How would someone else know that I was confident?
So interesting.
Because I think confidence is just such an interesting one, because like, you don't usually like wake up and just like feel confident about something. It comes with practice. Like I wasn't a confident therapist when I started doing therapy. You have to do it over and over again. And so, it kind of goes back to, I think, one of the DBT skills of like acting as if, like, yes, there might be a piece of you that
we're just halfway through. So we have
yes, okay.
Another 15 minutes for the meal portion for people who are kind of thinking about timing. And I'll let you know when we have 5 minutes left of the meal portion. So if you notice more than half your meal left on your plate right now, you might want to try to increase your pacing. Just, keep the hand to mouth process going. And I'll let you know when we have 5 minutes left. Sorry about that.
Sorry, 1 second. Peanut butter probably wasn't the best choice when you're like talking and eating. It's like that, like, all right,
I totally understand. I did that yesterday. I had peanut butter yesterday. I regretted it.
I know. I'm like, great. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's like kind of unpacking like what those things mean for you and then doing them anyway, right? So like someone might say like, if you're in, and there might be some validity to it. Like if I was in a smaller body, in my mind, I would have this belief that like I'm more accepted, and it might make it easier for me to go approach people, out at a party, let's say.
Yeah.
Right? And at the same time, like what we would want to work on is like, can you do that anyway? Like, can you approach that person? Can you appear confident, even if internally you don't feel confident at all,
So in a way, it's almost like these behavioral experiments.
Totally.
It's just go and try it. Just try it. Don't wait until you feel it fully.
Yeah.
But I think what I hear you saying is, what is confidence anyway? How do you even know that you're going to feel it fully?
Totally.
You might not feel confidence. It's not like you're going to hit the number that you want and you're going to feel confident overnight.
Exactly.
So the idea is that you try very hard to just do it anyway, even if you're not feeling it internally.
And then ultimately those things get unlinked, right? Like, oh, I can do these things. I can be happy. I can live the life I want. And it doesn't have to be so tied to my body size.
I mean, absolutely.
Yeah, easier said than done, obviously, but
that's the process over time. And I think you're tapping into something we spoke about a couple of sessions ago, and that comes up a lot here, which is about, how important it is to a recovery to connect with what's important to you and to engage in what's important to you. And of course, when you think about your values and what's important to you, many people who struggle with eating disorders have a value that they want to be healthy, that they want to, feel physically good and have a sense of well-being. But the only way to achieve that is not through weight loss. That there are many other ways to achieve good health. And what is good health? Good health means that so many things, that you take care of yourself, that you're compassionate and caring to yourself, that you engage in behaviors that are life affirming and that are health affirming.
Totally. And health is so holistic. Like, I'm so passionate about health at every size, and this idea of separating health from body size. There's such a misconception that body size has anything to do with health. And you can engage in health affirming behaviors at any body size. Like, it has nothing to do with your weight or weight loss.
Weight.
I think, right. So that can certainly be a value of yours, but that doesn't mean like weight loss equals health.
Yeah,
like,
that's not the way to get there. The other thing about values, when we do that experiment, there's a that 80th birthday exercise. People really love this one. And we did this one a couple of days ago as well. But the idea, think about it's your 80th birthday and everybody's coming together to celebrate you. You've had children, you have new people in your life, everyone's coming to toast you. And what do you want them to say about you? And very rarely do people say, well, I want my guests to toast how thin I've been my whole life, or, like how in control I've been of my eating. Very rarely do people highlight, those features as being important to them, but instead people usually say, well, I want people to view me as being present, engaged, caring, compassionate, that I'm, help people in my community, that I'm a good parent or I'm a good friend. And so it's very rare that there's anything that comes up around the most meaningful pursuits that have to do actually with body weight.
Totally. I love that exercise, because I think that then speaks to like kind of what's getting attached to thinness, right? Like it's like, oh, well, if I'm, in the mind, outside of that exercise, it might be like, oh, I can get all of those things if I'm thin.
Yeah.
But really, at the end of the day, it's not thinness you're wanting at, you know what I mean? Like it's all the other things.
Thinness is not going to get you those things. I mean, because if you think about it, oftentimes people will also say this, like they'll say, I hold myself to a different standard. I have many friends that are in different shapes and sizes, and I love them. I never think about their body weight or size. And the people that I'm closest to in my life, I don't care what size they are. That doesn't measure into my assessment of whether someone's lovable or somebody's a good friend or a good spouse or a good family member. And so there's this way that there's a different standard that people hold themselves to. It's okay for other people to be over, in a larger body, or it's okay for other people to eat and enjoy their food and have seconds of dessert. It's just not okay for me to do it. That's often what I'll hear.
Yeah. And it's so complicated, because I think that also speaks to, we talk about weight stigma in the external sense. You start talking about it like in the larger kind of world, and like that the idea that like certain bodies are actually oppressed. But then there's that internalized weight stigma, right? And I think that's what affects everyone of all body sizes, is this like internal, like there's something wrong if my body grows, or if I'm not trying to shrink my body, right? And I think that can be so much of what kind of gets internalized. Like it's okay for everyone else, but there's still this piece. And I think that's also such an important part to work through in some of this body image work, is like kind of what are your own associations that you're having? What are the things that are kind of coming up for you in that regard too?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And you also touched before on the fact that there weight loss or control over food somehow do get reinforced in our society. Not somehow, they do get reinforced in our society.
Totally.
And so oftentimes,
so complicated. Yeah.
The kind of the gateway into an eating disorder for so many people is it started with a diet or trying to get healthy, or some kind of effort that resulted in a little bit of weight loss that then might have been met with some kind of reinforcement from the environment. You look great. How did you do that? And then that then feeds on itself, and it becomes more and more extreme. And what we know about people who struggle with eating disorders is that there are common kind of temperament factors. There's like a common kind of temperament that we see in eating disorders. People with eating disorders tend to be very driven, very perfectionistic, and very, very focused on achievement. And so it's sort of a perfect storm for that person who might start with a little bit of weight loss, get some reinforcement, and then just put all of their energy into this one thing.
Right. And this one thing that people are saying is the thing to do, right? Like that this is what is valued. Like everyone should be, like in the larger picture, right? Like we see this everywhere. So
which is why I really love it when we can highlight people out there in the world, public figures who are not the thin ideal, that are not really about being super skinny, but they're about other messages, and really taking in their personas and thinking about what are you really admiring about this person. And it's not, the body shape and size is just one small piece really of what we value in like leaders in our society. right?
Totally. Yeah. And I think representation matters, like, is what you're right. Like, I feel like there's more people now coming into, like, you know, in movies and things like that, like in more mainstream, that are in larger bodies, but historically that's been kind of left out. And I think, you know, I think social media has its pros and cons, but something that I do often recommend to my clients is to kind of diversify your social media feed.
Great
You know,
advice.
it kind of goes back to this idea of like comparisons, right? Like, if we're constantly surrounded by media and people who are in smaller bodies, like, that's kind of the comparison with which you have, right? But people exist in all body sizes and shapes and have so much more to offer than their bodies, like, you know. And so I think if you know, even though I think there's still a huge lag in terms of like or there's just not a lot of representation, I think, in mainstream media, maybe more so a little bit now, but I think doing what you can to kind of cultivate that for yourself and surround yourself by people who, you know, are of all different body sizes, and just
I love that idea of diversifying your social media network, you know, really intentionally. Really think about it and say, okay, I'm going to like get rid of this one, and I'm going to get rid of this one, and I'm going to add this person and this person and this person, because social media is so in our faces all the time, especially right now.
Totally.
Given the crisis. And so really nurturing your mind, like your brain and your psyche, by exposing yourself to people, to energy that is going to be in line with what you're working on.
And messages, right?
What messages do you want to expose yourself to?
Because I think like another big helpful piece of this too is like kind of changing the narratives you're telling yourself, right? Like kind of telling yourself more neutral things about your body, or challenging some of those, like, you know, negative body image thoughts that come up. I think that, you know, ultimately what you're trying to do is like rewire your brain so that
5 more minutes for the portion. Don't worry, Courtney, you're doing so much talking. I don't expect you to be able to finish your lunch right now.
But so I think it's, you know, one skill you can use is starting to really kind of identify what are those thoughts that you're having and challenge them. And if it feels too hard to say something that's like, you know, really vastly different, like thinking about something that's more neutral. But one way I think to change the pathways is by surrounding yourself with messaging that is like more in line with that, right? Like you know, I know now there's like all of that kind of like workout stuff on social media about like the quarantine and working out. And, you know, people were, you know, a lot of people have been talking about it. And I was actually, you know, it was funny because I realized like, oh, I haven't like seen a whole lot of those. And the reason isn't because they don't exist, but it's because like my own, like what I'm kind of surrounding myself with, like it's not that kind of message. So it was like, I actually think I saw more of like the rebuttal to it before I even saw, like the messages that were like work out and, you know, all of that stuff, because I was like, oh, and I think in that moment I realized like how much that actually has been a support to me, in that like, you know, I don't, you know, I'm not seeing those messages as frequently. And so it really does make a difference.
That's so interesting. So you can, in a way, curate your own environment. You can kind of create your own environment. You can decide to connect with messaging that feels reinforcing and disconnect from messaging that doesn't. And it's so interesting that it could actually really, for real, change your environment. Like that's such an interesting thing that you're sharing, that then you wake up in the morning and when you go on your phone, you're actually not bombarded with messaging about exercise. Instead, you're being kind of targeted by maybe more positive messaging, or messaging that's more in line with your values. I think that's the coolest, really concrete. Anytime we can take control of a situation, I say, more power to you.
Totally. And it just kind of gets those messages like in your brain. Like I know that sometimes I find like with my clients, which understandably so, like your brain's been telling you these things for such a long time, like to start to come up with something that feels so foreign to you and challenge your brain with it. Like sometimes that can feel really, really hard. So I think even it's almost like borrowing messages from other people.
Messages.
Try like take them. And they often, you know, at first you might be like, oh, like I don't identify with that. But ultimately we're trying to kind of rewire the pathways in our brain so that like that does come a little bit more frequently, and then it's like more natural.
And I think one thing that we're noticing in just we've started this live stream about a week ago, and since we started, we've had so many guests who have come on who talk about their own recoveries. And, you know, I think what I'm hearing from them is this idea that they've taken some control over the situation. They've chosen to redirect their energies into pursuits that are life affirming and self-supporting, as opposed to the endless quest, the treadmill of trying to lose.
Yeah. Totally.
And so I think that's kind of what I'm hearing from you, Courtney, is about, taking control of your environment, curating your environment, and just practicing new ways of thinking, which what we know from people in recovery is they do eventually stick.
Yep, totally.
So
they do. It takes time, but it
takes time.
Yeah.
But, McCall Dempsey on last Monday was on. I mean, she is done with her eating disorder.
Yep, totally.
Jenny Shaver was on yesterday, and she was talking about how she still struggles with, sometimes depression, anxiety, but she's not in her eating disorder anymore. I mean, really,
totally.
You can rewire the brain. You can find a way out.
Totally. And that doesn't mean, and it doesn't mean you're never going to have a thought again, right? But I think with a lot of these,
so you will.
Right. And you're going to have a bad body image, because like, who doesn't? But I think, a lot of this is kind of figuring out, like, what do I do with that, and what does it mean when it comes up, right? Like, how do I, can I challenge it a little bit more quickly, or does that next thought kind of come more easily than it had in the past? And ultimately, that can, that really helps over time.
Yeah. So, we're done with our eating portion. Folks out there, we're going to do a little bit more work here together. So feel free to tag a friend or invite other people to join. I'm loving having Courtney here. Courtney and I usually work in the same office. And so now with this crisis, I haven't seen her at all in quite a long time. And now she's in her private practice also. So it's really nice to have lunch with you and
you too. So, I know. It's always, I feel like this time it's so nice to be able to just like connect with people and do this kind of FaceTiming stuff, because otherwise it's hard.
So, we're at the end of the meal portion. And so this is a time when people may have a lot of feelings. Oftentimes there's a lot of anxiety, there's second guessing, there's shame. I'm going to share kind of my experience. I completed my meal. I really enjoyed it. I'm really grateful that, that quesadilla turned out much better than I expected. And if I'm checking into my hunger fullness cues, I'm definitely feeling comfortably full. I'm not feeling overly full. I feel like that kind of good feeling that I'm satiated. And I think that part of what allowed me to be satisfied by this meal is that it was varied. It had adequate fat. I mean, fat is definitely a component that helps you to feel satisfied after you eat. It holds you for longer. Courtney, I know you didn't really get to finish your meal, but how's it going?
I did finish it actually.
Oh, you did?
I accomplished it. No, I finished my meal. Yeah, it was good. It was, I think it's funny because I think like we're talking, I don't even think I realized how much, or not how much, but like that I was eating. It wasn't so mindful for me, which is fine, right? Like I think it's like the whole experience sometimes around food that like, we're it doesn't have to be all about, that it's like I'm eating because I'm eating and I'm having conversation, and this kind of the whole experience feels nourishing for me, with the food.
I just want to share, somebody sent a message and said, I finished my turkey sandwich and pretzels with an exclamation point. Yay, you. Way to go. And I think also, Courtney, I think you're onto something that comes up often. I think when people have a very restricted lifestyle around eating, the meal becomes much more important.
Totally. Yeah.
So people who restrict will wait all day for dinner, and the dinner meal becomes really important. You want to know that it's going to be delicious. You want to enjoy it as much as you can, because in your mind, you have this fear that it's not going to be there again later. And so part of what we really work on in eating disorder treatment is working on regular eating, consistency, knowing, teaching your body that it will be fed. And that process significantly reduces the emphasis that you end up placing on food.
Totally.
A well-fed body, in a well-fed body, your mind is not thinking about food as much. You're able to be satisfied after a meal.
Totally.
But it takes some time to get there.
For sure. Yeah.
So since we finished the meal, one thing I thought we would talk about, Courtney, is that oftentimes after meals, people engage in certain checking behaviors. So there's an experience after a meal that you can feel some more fullness, your belly may be sticking out more, you can feel the pressure maybe against your pants. And that sensation can lead to a lot of feelings and potentially more behaviors. So how do you've done so many meal supports, you've been in thousands of meal supports over these years. How do you work on that with people? That post-meal kind of fullness, discomfort, the thoughts that are activated?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things. I mean, I think to start, I think it can be super helpful to have a plan in advance of the meal around like what you might do afterwards that could be distracting, right? So a lot of like what might come up might be feelings of guilt, which I could also talk about, but yeah, like feelings that might come up after a meal, or it's also possible like our stomachs do, you know, as they're digesting, they do get maybe more bloated or more full feeling. And oftentimes, you know, if you're struggling with an eating disorder, you might be hyper vigilant to that sensation or feeling, which is super, super normal. So finding something that can either be distracting, engaging, coming up with that beforehand, I think can be helpful. But if you don't get the chance, like making an effort to maybe call a friend, you know, play a game on your phone, do something. And then I think also really, really working hard to refrain from urges to body check, right? Because you know, if you're thinking about your body, oftentimes that leads to engaging in behaviors that might be kind of in an attempt to reduce some anxiety, figure out what is my body doing? How is it right now? Like, is it okay? You know, and understandably, when those thoughts come up, like the urge might be to do something, whether that's like a body checking behavior or weigh yourself or things like that.
In the mirror, pinching, you know, there are different behaviors, touching, pulling.
Yeah. Right. Just to kind of like get a sense of like, what is my body doing? So really trying to work on reducing that. I honestly think some body checking behaviors are so hard to challenge because they feel so ingrained. So, you know, it might not be going cold turkey and not doing any of it, but like choosing one way in which you can reduce that behavior somewhat. So if it's in terms of time, like reducing the amount of time spent looking in the mirror or something like that, or just being mindful of it to start, so that you're like noticing that you're doing it, but really trying to reduce that, and over time, ideally like eliminating it, so that because that just reinforces kind of the thinking about it.
Yeah, it's interesting how sometimes people think that if they change their thinking, they'll be able to change the behaviors. But sometimes it helps to change the behavior. Well, often it helps to change the behaviors because then the thinking will follow.
Totally. Yeah. Oh no. So I was just going to say about that. Something I always say is like, you know, we can think a lot of things. We know things like, you know, I will say people with eating disorders are often like the smartest, most creative, intelligent people I've ever met, you know, so, you know, you might know a lot of things, but that doesn't necessarily change like that internal experience, that internal knowing. And so I find that behaviorally it kind of bridges the gap between that, because you're like actually learning. It's like you're learning like, oh, this is what happens if I do this thing versus like if I just tell myself, right? So like challenging the thoughts is important too, but behaviors can help really give that concrete evidence, help you see like I can tolerate this, or you know, or it's like really super hard, but like I can do it, or like it's not as bad as I thought, right? And like that can ultimately help really change a lot of the thinking too.
Actually, I think because behaviors can be quantified. So let's say you have 5 checking behaviors you engage in after meals. You know, it's not a bad idea to count them and to really get some data on how in what ways are you checking, or trying to get reinforcement, in what ways and how often. But it can really build a lot of confidence and some momentum and recovery to recognize, you know, I usually check 5 times and I did 4 today. And that's a huge shift. And I think it can quantifying in that way and taking that step forward really builds confidence.
For
Especially
sure.
because you're building confidence in the fact that you did it and you still survived, you're okay. And maybe even, you know, you might have even had some momentary sense of pride in yourself, or some kind of positive experience internally because you accomplished something that you set out to do. So
totally. And I think over time you then see like the anxiety reduces, right? So like there's going to be anxiety initially to start because you're taking away this thing that you've been using to try to reduce anxiety. But over time, then you see like feeling shift too, that like it's no longer as anxiety inducing, and that then can impact our thoughts. So it all kind of goes together.
This is such a good conversation. I wonder if maybe we can give our listeners a little assignment. to think about, because I really do like that idea of making that pie chart.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
just to do a little self-assessment and think about, when you think about all the parts of yourself that contribute to your identity and how you feel about yourself and who you are, to think about what are those components. So how much does family take up? How much does career or school, academic success, how much does that take up? How much does community, how you connect with the world around you, how much does that take up? How much do hobbies, activities, enrichment, how much does that take up? And then think about how much does your body and your body weight and your appearance take up? And I think exercise, if you use exercise as a way to control your body weight, I would probably put that in as well. And thinking really about how much time a day do you devote to thinking about these things, how much time do you engage in activities in support of these ideas, and then just try to see where you land. What does that pie chart look like? And reflect on whether you feel comfortable with what you're seeing. And if you're noticing that body shape, weight, food control, exercise control, if that's taking up a disproportionate amount of your pie, what that really means is that you're putting a lot of eggs in that basket, and it may indicate that it could be problematic longer term. And so it's really an important time to begin. Maybe you're not going to even begin to try to even think about it as chipping away at the body image, but instead think about, how can I just spend more time on the other things?
Totally. Yeah.
How can I just, on my way out today, well, nobody's getting out, but let's say you were getting out on a walk, on that walk today, instead of thinking about food or calculating or body, how much of that walk can you spend thinking about something else that's important to you? And then boom, you've done it. You have increased the amount of time in your day that you're devoting to other things that are important to you. And that's how you build up.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, now is especially a kind of a tough time, and that there's like a limit to what we can do. But I think kind of, figuring out, like, is there something within this context that will help you feel like you can expand that part, whether it's like reaching out to a friend or, like, I know a value of mine is like learning and self-development. So is it like, watching this or or doing some sort of training or something that can help you kind of increase the time. Yeah, I think that's.
And I think the idea of kind of doing a makeover to your social media, who you're following, that kind of makeover sounds like a really great project.
Yeah, totally. And it can be hard sometimes to let go of some people, but you get used to it.
Yeah, one at a time.
Yeah.
Maybe, the rule is I'm going to give up one and I'm going to add one.
Yeah. I like that.
Out.
Yeah. Or even just like add first, and then you could,
Yeah, that's a good idea too. But I'm struck with that concept because I really feel that can be dramatic in terms of, we spend so much time looking at our devices, and if you can, and especially now because we're confined. So we really, our reality is whomever we're confined with and what we see in our media. So it's really an unusual opportunity to kind of make something positive of it, that you're creating your own environment now. I love that idea. I'm totally into it.
Okay.
Leave it to you, Courtney. Well, listen, it was really good to see you. And I hope you'll come back and we can talk some more.
Yeah, for
this
sure.
was a really enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, this was so great. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
And for anyone listening out there, we really hope you'll come back. On the My 3 Square, it's my number 3 Square website. There's a calendar of upcoming guests, and we're expanding the guests. Actually, the week of the 20th is going to be a Project Heal week. I'm really excited to announce that. So we're going to have different representatives from Project Heal coming on the show for a week and talking about their experiences, many of whom their experiences relate to their own recovery stories. So I think that's a really nice thing for us all to benefit from, what has really helped people who have made it through. And I see somebody said thank you. And I really appreciate that. And actually, that's something I really want to encourage. If folks want to send questions or comments, we'd love to be able to integrate some of those comments and questions into our show. So looking forward. Thanks, everybody. I hope you all have a great day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.